Good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's program. My name is Melyssa Laureano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you unfamiliar with DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of Washington, DC through advocacy and education. So I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free public programs like this one today. And they are Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Buyer Blender Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. So many thanks to you all for your dedication to preservation. This program is also brought to you in collaboration with the DC Office of Planning's Historic Preservation Office, the Rainbow History Project, and the Capital Pride Alliance. So we greatly appreciate their partnership and participation in tonight's discussion, and I will be putting their websites in the chat momentarily. So with that, I am so happy to introduce you all to today's presenter. So Dr. Rebecca Graham is the Director of Institutional Assessment and Outcomes at the University of the District of Columbia. Prior to this role, Rebecca served as an instructional consultant at UDC's Center for the Advancement of Learning. She came to UDC from the Association of American Colleges and Universities, where she worked in multi-state, multi-campus projects that focused on learning outcome assessment, equitable student learning, and faculty development. Rebecca has taught courses on gender and sexuality at various institutions in the DMV and is the co-author of the Historic Context Statement for Washington's LGBTQ resources, which we'll be talking about tonight. She received her BA in Sociology from Kent State University, her MA in Sociology from Ohio University, and her PhD in Sociology Feminist Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And with that, I am excited to pass things along to Rebecca.
Thank you, Melissa, and thanks to everybody for joining us this evening. Okay, so again, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're going to be talking with you about the historic context statement for Washington's LGBTQ resources. And what I would like to do tonight is just spend some time going through the themes of the context statement, because what we're interested in is, gathering some thoughts on what potentially could be missing in the context statement. So at the end of the presentation, we'll open the conversation up for some feedback. And so what I'm about to present is an overview, basically. And we won't have time to go through absolutely everything and everyone addressed in the context statement, but I will do my absolute best to give you all a sense of the themes, and we'll take it from there. So, prior to the context statement, we had a couple of LGBTQ sites in DC that had already been marked for a National Registry of Historic Places. And that, of course, would be Dr. Franklin E. Kamney's residence and the Furies Collective House. We're thrilled for these historic sites and their place on the National Register, but of course the context statement exists to add to the wonderful work that was put in making sure that those two sites are included in the National Register. So again, as we go through the themes, a lot of sites we're going to talk about a lot of organizations and folks, and sites will be popping into people's minds, and you're going to see some images from the context study and a little bit outside of the context study where you'll see that. I'll have a link to, wherever I got that image from online. And so as we'll go through the themes, again, I want you to think about maybe what's missing, what you would add to a context study as we can, hopefully aim to broaden it. So theme 1 provides more of a national overview on some related historical events. So we're actually going to kind of skip over that theme and go straight to theme 2. The title of theme 2, I guess, or the chapter itself is called Politics and the Quest for Civil Rights. So Lafayette Square, as folks know, many folks know, I'm sure, it was a cruising spot for gay men in the first half of the 20th century. This time period included the McCarthy era, when gay and lesbian federal workers were targeted and fired from their jobs because of their quote unquote scandalous behavior, such as cruising, which was targeted by undercover police officers. Cruising was supposedly considered a quote unquote security risk to the nation, according to the feds, because it left gay and lesbian federal workers open to blackmail. So Dr. Franklin E. Kameny was one of the federal workers who was targeted, investigated, and fired for said homosexual conduct. In other words, he was fired for being gay. Dr. Kameny, as a former federal worker, appealed his case with the help of the ACLU, but he ultimately lost the case. The injustice was ceded, however, and Kameny co-founded the Mattachine Society of Washington in 1961 with Jack Nichols. The Mattachine Society of Washington, or MSW for short, was part of the larger homophile movement, a gay rights movement that started in Los Angeles. The context statement covers some of the iconic moments of MSW's activism, such as their picketing in front of the White House and other federal landmarks. Plus, Dr. Kameny's run for DC's non-voting congressional delegate in 1971. Theme 2 also highlights the Gay Activists Alliance, the Gertrude Stein Democratic Club, and the Langston Hughes Eleanor Roosevelt Democratic Club. The theme also highlights, and there's some folks from MSW picketing around federal landmarks. The theme also highlights the DC Coalition of Black Gays and the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays. In spring of 1979, A. Billy S. Jones Hennon co-founded the DC Coalition, which eventually led to the founding of the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays with chapters in Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, Minneapolis, New York, and Philadelphia, among other cities. NCBLG placed intersectionality at the center of its work while exposing racism and sexism in parts of the gay community and homophobia in parts of the Black community. Theme 3 digs into the identity politics of activist groups. For example, the Mattachine Society of Washington's slogan, "Gay is good," which was groundbreaking in its affirmation of gay folks in the 1960s. Although groundbreaking, the word gay could not encompass the identities and experiences of all queer folks. And as the 1970s took hold, some lesbian activists in DC, such as Eva Freund of the Mattachine Society of Washington and Nancy Tucker of the Gay Liberation Front in DC, openly criticized the groups for placing women at the margins of organizing. As an out lesbian, Eva Freund also co-founded the National Organization for Women's National Organization for Women's Capitol Hill chapter, and she co-chaired the Now Sexuality Task Force. In the same time period, Washington, D.C.'s Furies Collective was founded by radical lesbian separatist feminists who actively resisted patriarchy and capitalism and shifted feminist discourse at the national level through their newsletter. The newsletter also featured Joan E. Byron's photography. Byron co-founded the Furies, and she would begin publishing her groundbreaking photographs of diverse lesbians at the end of the 1970s. Theme 3 also highlights the racist and discriminatory practices in some of the DC gay nightclubs, with activists picketing bars and nightclubs for denying entry, primarily to African Americans and also lesbians and folks in drag. Gay Liberation Front DC is also featured in this chapter, along with their ZAPs, which were militant but nonviolent face-to-face confrontations against oppressive or repressive institutions. This theme also features some of the political organizers, such as the Gay and Lesbian Activists Alliance and Melvin Boozer, who was the president of the Gay and Lesbian Activists Alliance from 1979 to 1981. The chapter places additional focus on the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, including their iconic march from Howard University to the first National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights in 1979. The theme also focuses on the DC chapter of Black and White Men Together, a social organization with a political focus, and Sapphire Sapphos, which was created and organized by African-American lesbians in DC as a political, social, and cultural group. Some individuals in the mainstream white gay movement in DC were still describing gay identity in static terms into the late 1970s. And Sapphire Sapphos' mission was embracing all third world sisters, our dreams, our endeavors, our struggles. Chai Hughes, co-founder of Sapphire Sapphos, also co-founded Lambda Student Alliance at Howard University, which was the first recorded queer student activist group at an HBCU. This chapter also touches upon, and last, the first known Latinx LGBTQ group in the district, which began organizing during the summer of 1987, following the 1987 National March on Washington. An important note here, the context study and its foci could use a deeper dive in general beyond like the mid to late 1980s. So I want to make that note for the what's missing conversation. Theme 4 highlights bars, clubs, and restaurants in DC, including early establishments such as the Chicken Hut, which opened in 1948, Nob Hill, which opened in 1953, Phase 1, which opened in 1971, and the Clubhouse, which opened in 1975. DC Black social clubs are also highlighted in this theme. Social clubs were an alternative to the bar restaurant scene for Black and white folks and men and women. Washington's Black social clubs created alternative spaces for Black gays to come together and socialize with one another on their own terms. The Black social clubs featured in this theme include the Group, the Associates, and the Best of Washington. This theme also dives deeper into the racist practice of carding in some of the mainstream gay nightclubs during the 1970s. Theme 4 also highlights the DC's deeply historical drag scene and the Gay Women's Open House, which was founded and organized by Mattachine Society of Washington's Lily Vincennes, who opened her home for nearly a decade to queer women in the DC area who are seeking to socialize outside of the bar scene. Theme 4 also features Llamas and Lambda Rising, DC queer bookstores with a huge neighborhood and community-wide presence, thanks to Mary Farmer and Deacon McCubbin, the owners and operators of Llamas and Lambda Rising, respectively. The theme also features several businesses, clubs, restaurants, etc., in various areas of DC, including DuPont Circle, Georgia Avenue near Howard University, Georgetown, Capitol Hill, and Adams Morgan. So theme 5 dives deeper into drag in DC with some of the nation's earliest drag events occurring in DC during the late 1800s. For example, the theme covers the Washington Academy, which was a drag organization and one of DC's longest lived LGBTQ organizations. The Academy's artistic, political, and commercial influence was recognized by the Smithsonian's Archive Center at the National Museum of American History in 2018. And a collection of photos, program books, newsletters, and organizational history will become part of the Smithsonian's Archives Center. Alan Kress incorporated the Academy in 1971, along with Carl Rizzi, who performed as Mame Dennis and served as its president until his death in 2015. According to Donna L. Gates, a female drag king who joined the Academy in 1972, we had people of all ethnicities, women, men, straight, gay, bi, trans. Under Rizzi's leadership, the Academy incorporated 2 major pageants, Miss Gay University C, and Miss Gay America DC. Theme 5 also focuses on Howard University influencers, like Dr. Alan Locke, a Harvard graduate who taught at Howard University from 1916 to 1953. Philosopher and professor, Locke was a critical influence on the development of the Black gay literary canon. He mentored several young Black Harlem Renaissance era artists of renown, including Langston Hughes. Dean Lucy Slough of Howard University was the first dean of women and a founding member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha, the first sorority founded by African-American women. She was also the first dean of women at any American university. Her friend and companion, Mary Burrell, was an English teacher and a respected writer of the Harlem Renaissance era. Major newsletters and publications from DC gay and lesbian groups are also featured in this theme. And so is Enoch Alley Coffee House, which was located in the carriage house behind Ray Melrose and Gary Walker's row house of Northeast DC. The coffee house opened in New Year's Day of 1982. Melrose was president of the DC Coalition at the time, and the DC Coalition's meetings were held there, making the space political, social, and artistic. The coffee house was a vital space for Black, lesbian, gay, and bisexual artists to regularly rehearse and present their work. Activists/artists such as Michelle Parkerson, Wason Jones, Essex Hemphill, Papaya Man, Chai Hughes, and Larry Duckett would perform at the coffee house. Michelle Parkerson, who was also a member of Sapphire Sapphos and the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, would later become a renowned filmmaker. Parkerson describes the nationalization and even internationalization of the local Black, lesbian, and gay artistic scene in DC as taking hold around the release of Joseph Beam's book, In the Life. The book did extremely well, and it helped circulate the DC Black gay Renaissance with the coffee house at the center of the Renaissance. Theme 6 starts with the sickness theory, with gay and lesbian activists targeting the American Psychiatric Association for its designation of homosexuality as a disorder. The Mattachine Society of Washington publicly criticized the APA in the 1960s in its newsletters, and Dr. Frank Kameny, Lily Vincennes, and Barbara Giddings attended panels at APA conferences to criticize the APA even more visibly. The Gay Men's Venereal Disease Clinic, Whitman Walker Health, the Washington Free Clinic, and the Lesbian Health Services Project are all also highlighted in Theme 6. And this chapter gives quite a bit of focus to the AIDS crisis in DC and the immediate response from activists through the 1980s, most of the 1980s. Featured organizations include the Whitman Walker Clinic, Metropolitan Community Church, Hughes Roosevelt Democratic Club, the Clubhouse, National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays, Black Gay Social Groups, Damien Ministries, and the Inner City AIDS Network. Theme 6 also highlights the activist work of Chai Hughes through the Whitman Walker Clinic. Hughes educated the public about the AIDS epidemic, and she directed the Minority Outreach Program to Black and Latinx communities through the AIDS crisis. A. Billy S. Jones-Hennon was also the Associate Director of the Sonny Sherman AIDS Education and Prevention Service during the crisis, and Bishop Kwabena Rainey Cheeks founded Us Helping Us, a nonprofit organization to lessen the impact of HIV/AIDS in the entire Black community. LGBTQ religious leaders and various houses of worship and ministries are discussed in Theme 7, including Integrity Washington, St. Mark's Episcopal Church, Washington Community Church of Metropolitan Community Church of Washington, DC, Friends Meeting of Washington, Westminster Presbyterian Church, Dignity Washington, and Bet Mishpachah. Reverend Dr. James S. Tinney, Bishop Kwabena Rainey Cheeks, and Reverend Elder Dr. Candace Schultes, as well as Imam Dai Abdullah, are among the spiritual leaders who are highlighted in this theme. LGBTQ spirituality extended to nature-based religions as well, and theme 7 highlights the lesbian feminist Dianic Coven and the Radical Fairies. Local religious institutions played a major role during the AIDS epidemic in DC, which is also highlighted in this chapter. And that is the end of my presentation. So that should hopefully give folks an overview of what the themes themselves, as well as some of the major organizations and folks who are covered within the themes.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. That was a really great overview of the study. And again, as a reminder, everybody, think about, any feedback you have, what you'd like to see added or see in the future, and we'll ask you to put those in the chat after my portion. So I'm going to go over a few nominations that were either newly created or amended as like a product of the context study. So first I'm going to go over the newly created nominations and newly designated sites. So we have the Slow Burrell House, we have the Slow Burrell House and Annie's Paramount Steakhouse. And before I go into it, I do want to mention that EHT Traceries, they were the ones who prepared the nominations. So thank you, I'm thanking them for their hard work. Okay, so the Slow Burrell House, located on Kearney Street Northeast in Brookland. This Queen Anne house was built by James T. Ward in 1890 and eventually became home to two of DC's most influential and distinguished African-American educators, Lucy Diggs Slough and Mary Burrell, which you can see in the lower corner there. The two women met in 1912 because of their shared professional background and decided to purchase the home together after Slough was appointed Dean of Women at her alma mater, Howard University, in 1922. And they lived here together until Slough's death in 1937. Slough had a very prestigious career in the education field, including being tasked by the district to establish the first public junior high school for Black Washingtonians. And after a few years serving as the school's principal, as Rebecca mentioned, Slough accepted an offer to become Howard University's first Dean of Women in 1922. As Dean of Women, Slough introduced new curriculum to female students and encouraged them to consider and pursue varied degrees beyond the traditional path of teaching. Mary Burrell remained a dedicated educator throughout her life. She taught at a number of district schools during her career, but her longest tenure was at Dunbar High School. An admired educator, Burrell taught many subjects during her tenure, such as English, history, speech, and drama. She was a well-known playwright and active in the years preceding the Harlem Renaissance. Her plays explored a number of subjects, including race and gender. Her work was significant in encouraging and inspiring the preceding generations of Black artists, writers, and critics. And in December 2019, DCPL submitted a nomination to designate the Slow Burrell House as a DC landmark in partnership with homeowners Ben and Don O'Connell. And it was officially designated in April 2020. The Slow Burrell House meets DC Inventory Criterion C at the local level for its association with the life and productive career of Lucy Slough. It also meets Criterion B in the area of social history as the location of what is thought to be one of the most prominent female same-sex relationships in DC during the early 20th century. Lucy and Mary were very private about their relationship during this earlier era of societal prejudice and non-acceptance. However, their relationship endured for over 20 years up until Lucy's passing. And here's some other photos of them. And if you would like to know more about this site or any of the others that I'm talking about tonight, you can always check out their nomination forms, which are available to the public. And specifically for this site here, Traceries led a webinar about the home and Lucy and Mary for DCPL earlier this year, and you can watch that on our YouTube channel after this presentation if you want. And I will put the link to that in the chat in a bit. Okay, so now the second site, which is actually two sites, is Annie's Paramount Steakhouse. So the nomination for Annie's is unusual because it is a non-contiguous landmark designation. So Annie's has occupied two sites. It operated out of 1519 17th Street Northwest from 1948 until 1985, at which time it moved to 1609, 1611 17th Street Northwest. So that's the first location on the top there, and the second and current location is the second photo. So 1519 17th Street is a two-story Italianate building constructed in 1878, and it's now operating as JR's Bar. 1609 to 1611 17th Street consists of two interconnected commercial buildings, with 1609 constructed in 1904 in the Italianate style, and 1611 constructed in 1926 in the Tudor Revival style. So when George Katinas leased the property at 1519 in 1948, he changed the name from the Paramount Cafe to the Paramount Steakhouse. And George's younger sister, Annie, worked at the restaurant and became a favorite of the patrons. And I'll come back to this slide, but here you can see that's Annie in the corner there in that photo. So she became a favorite of the patrons, and George added Annie's name to the restaurant in 1962 when it officially became Annie's Paramount Steakhouse. So as early as the 1950s, the restaurant became known as a local safe haven for DC's LGBTQ community. At Annie's, they could freely engage in getting to know each other at a time when society at large and the federal government forced many individuals to hide their identities. Before the widespread establishment of gay bars and nightclubs in the 1970s, restaurants like Annie's were critical for DC's gay community. In December 2020, the Historic Preservation Review Board voted unanimously in support of its designation. Annie's Paramount Steakhouse meets DC Inventory Criterion A for its association with events that contributed significantly to the heritage and culture of DC, and DC Inventory Criterion B for its association with social movements and groups that contributed significantly to the heritage and culture of DC. So Annie's built its ties to the LGBTQ community in its original location at 1519 and maintained those ties when it moved to its current location. So just as an example, the high heel race, a popular DuPont Circle event, began in 1986 as a sprint between JR's and Annie's. And if I'm not mistaken, it just happened the other night. So that is a long time event that Annie's is a part of. Annie's has also been the site of numerous weddings since gay marriage was legalized in DC in 2010. So although Annie passed away in 2013 and George passed away in 2014, the restaurant is still owned and operated by their family and continues to be a significant local LGBTQ site. So again, looking at these photos, we have Annie up there in the corner. Below that, we have a photo of the Paramount Steakhouse, likely in the 1960s. And then to the right there, we have the original Paramount Steakhouse again. Undated, but my thought is this is probably like the 1960s, 1970s as well. Okay. So those were the two new nominations and new designations that came out of, were a product of the study. But now I want to talk about two sites that were already landmarked and whose nominations were amended to include their ties to LGBTQ history in DC. Okay, so the two sites are the All Souls Church Unitarian and St. Elizabeth's Hospital campus. So beginning in 1970, All Souls became an early leader in the gay rights movement. The church was the physical home of the newly established Community Church of Washington, the district's first known LGBTQ worship group. And during the late 1970s, All Souls began performing unitement ceremonies for same-sex couples, ultimately becoming the first religious entity in the city to embrace marriage equality for all. On the other hand, from its opening in 1855 through the 1960s, St. Elizabeth's Hospital classified and treated homosexuality as a mental illness and confined individuals to be cured through various and inhumane medical and psychological practices. This history was not included in the original nomination and has since been updated to include it. And I think it's a good example of why it's important to review existing nominations to ensure omitted stories are recognized, addressed, and documented. So that was my little bit there. And I am done. So I would like to invite all of our panelists to turn their cameras on. And Steve or Rebecca, if either of you had any other notes about the sites that I had talked about, please feel free to share them now if you'd like.
I don't have anything to add to what you summarized there. I thought that was very good. Just to give a little bit of a background to this whole study that was done, the LGBTQ historic context study that Rebecca talked about. This is part of a sort of a broader movement in the preservation, in the national preservation community, and I just want to give a plug to the National Park Service for providing these grants to help state historic preservation offices and municipal governments do this sort of study to evaluate resources of underrepresented communities, whose stories have generally not been recorded as well, nor documented and nominated to the National Register. And so ultimately, the goal of these grants is to encourage local communities and states to do these sorts of studies, to document this history, make people more aware of it, and to promote these sorts of nominations, both, as you just pointed out, sort of new nominations of properties that people wouldn't necessarily think would be a landmark quality building, not necessarily great architecture, or associated with sort of historical figures that most people commonly associate with. As well as looking at old nominations, existing properties, and bringing the LGBTQ and other underrepresented communities history within those nominations. This was the first nomination, or the first historic context study we received a grant for from the National Park Service. We've subsequently received two others, one to look at women's suffrage and the history of women's suffrage in DC, which is currently ongoing, as well as a grant to look at the Korean and Chinese community in DC, which is also ongoing. And we also have lots of plans to be applying for additional grants because this is a great source of money and a great opportunity to broaden the perspectives of how people think of historic preservation and heritage beyond just sort of great architecture and sort of the sites that everybody sort of assumes should be protected. However, what's been really interesting about it, and Rebecca Miller, you can sort of chime in on this as well, is that it's been a little bit of an unusual ride. I think we've been sort of like testing the waters with this. Both of our nominations, the new nominations that you summarized for the Slow Burrell House and for Annie's, didn't just sail through in terms of their listings on the National Register. We got some pushback on both of them for different reasons, slightly different reasons, and in the history that was outlined, you saw that there's a tremendous amount of history that's documented from the 1960s on. That's where the record becomes much richer, and we still have people living who can tell us the history. It's a little bit more opaque earlier than that. It's not that there are no representations of that earlier history. So we're dealing not only with a historically marginalized community, but we're also dealing with relatively recent historical sites. We're dealing with sites that sometimes have integrity problems. They don't necessarily, look the same way they did. Some of them, as you saw in some of the images, some of them are vacant, some of them are deteriorated. And some of them were quite temporal. These institutions or these entities were located in a certain location and they moved because they got a better deal on the rent, or they just had to move to a different area of town, or something. So it's a little bit more of an ephemeral history in terms of its physical manifestation in specific places. So it has been challenging to find properties that rise to the level of significance, that retain sufficient integrity, that if they're less than 50 years old in terms of their significance, rise to an exceptional level of significance as is required by the National Register. So it has been challenging. And Rebecca, I don't know if you wanted to, Rebecca Miller, I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit about some of the feedback that we received on the nominations and some of the back and forth that we had to go through.
Certainly. Specifically, so with the Slow Burrell House, which was when Steve and I were actually going through the context statement and looking for which nominations we were going to pursue, one, we were looking for sites that were significant, but also that were owner supported as well. We wanted this to be a good activity that we could find these sites. But one of the interesting things, some of the feedback that we initially received in DC was because both Slow and Burrell were just so significant in their own right, not because of their relationship. And so it had to be explained that this rose to the top of the pile because of this particular study. And then when it was submitted to the National Register, the feedback that we received was that we had no proof that they were in fact an LGBTQ couple. They had a relationship, they bought a house together, they were referred to as a same-sex couple in the document. There's no reference to their sexuality. And so that was the pushback we received on that one. Annie still has not been listed in the National Register because there was a question as to, one, because it's two different sites, that's a very unusual situation. But secondly, we received pushback because they said that the case hadn't been made that it is still, in fact, an active LGBTQ place of gathering place, which I was like, you can go there any day of the week. And so our consultants are now working with the National Register in order to provide additional information to that capacity. So it's been really interesting getting this feedback. It's one of the things that we found not only with the LGBTQ study, but also in African-American civil rights that we've been also working on, because a lot of these sites, as Steve mentioned, they either no longer exist, they've deteriorated because there has been a lack of investment in them, because they haven't been protected like your average site that was important to older white men, to be quite honest, straight white men. And so this is a lot of the feedback that we've been receiving, and it's frustrating when you're working to diversify this large inventory, and DC has a very large inventory of sites as well. We have about 700 or so individual landmarks, and to get that kind of feedback from the National Register, who is providing this funding, has been a little bit frustrating as we've been moving forward. But we'll persevere. We'll keep going.
Yeah.
And also, actually, there is a study for the National Historic Landmark Program going on currently on the Slow Burrell House. So maybe that's an interior program. So that perhaps a more education from that perspective will also assist in future nominations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess first, before we go further, I did want to introduce everybody just so that our audience is familiar with you all. So Steve Callcott is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the District of Columbia. With more than 25 years of project review experience, he oversees the daily operations of the HPO project review staff, develops design guidelines and preservation design review policies, and serves as the primary staff liaison to the Historic Preservation Review Board. Mr. Callcott is responsible for the review of many of the larger rehabilitation and new construction projects in the downtown and mid-city neighborhoods. Prior to joining HPO in 1992. He served for 4 years as Associate Director of the DC Preservation League. He has a BA in Architectural History from the University of North Carolina and an MA in Historic Preservation Planning from Cornell University. And we are also joined by Jeffrey Donahoe, who is a writer, editor, and communications consultant. Until December 2020, he worked at Georgetown University and was the longtime editor of Georgetown Magazine, the university's official publication. He is a member of Rainbow History Project, an all-volunteer organization that collects and preserves the LGBTQ history of metropolitan Washington. And he serves on the Rainbow History Board and heads its Oral History Project and gives tours of DuPont Circle as a historic LGBTQ neighborhood. And we are also joined by Rebecca Miller, Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. Just to give our audience some background on who our wonderful panelists are today. But yeah, I think, you know, this conversation started off very well. And I was wondering if maybe we can turn to the audience and see if they had any feedback or if they had any comments of what they've heard today in Rebecca's presentation or in the points that Rebecca Miller brought up just now. So let's see.
Looks like we do have one question in the Q&A, which is, where does media fit into the work? The Blade, Friends, radio, etc. That would be for you, Rebecca G.
Thanks, Rebecca. Sure, I can speak to that. So definitely in my overview, couldn't cover everything. So in the LGBTQ historic context statement, there is a section that focuses on LGBTQ publications, and the Gay Blade / Washington Blade is listed among those publications. And the publication section itself doesn't just include the Washington Blade / Gay Blade, which is what it was originally called, the Gay Blade. There's also a highlight of the Fury's newsletter, Blacklight magazine, Metro Weekly magazine. And in addition, the Mark Meinke, who is co-founder of Rainbow History Project, who served as an advisor on the context study and gave some fantastic feedback on the context study and its limitations, also said that for arts and expression, we didn't feature and should have featured Friends Radio, and that's actually included in the context statement itself. So there's a section of notes where it says theme 5, arts and expression, and here are the things that we should have also focused on. And there's a note in there saying that these various people, groups, etc., may have potential significance under NPS criterion A or B. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Yeah, I think so. And I guess, Jeff, a lot of, if you're looking through the context study, you notice that a lot of these resources come from the Rainbow History Project. So I was wondering if maybe you wanted to talk about your organization's like archive and maybe give people an idea of what they can find in it, and maybe in the Oral History Project too.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about, generally speaking, most of our collections. Rebecca and others who put the context study together made the incredibly intelligent first move of getting Mark Meinke involved, who is our founder and was longtime chair. And I can barely think of anybody who knows more about DC gay and lesbian and LGBTQ history and culture. So first wise move was that. At Rainbow History, as a kind of your local gay history society, we take a really broad, I would say we're part of historic preservation. We're not about the built environment per se. We're interested in the built environment, but we are about preserving history. So one of the things that this study drew from was, Rebecca did a ton of individual new original interviews, but she was also able to draw on our oral history collection. I see a lot of things were drawn from our archives collection, which is a curated version of it is available on our website, but the DC History Center is where we keep that, and they're our archiving partner, and they're a fantastic archival partner. I think one of the things that may have been most useful for this study is that one of our ongoing projects, since we were founded 21 years ago next week, is our Places and Spaces database, which is by location, what were gathering spots like, who went there, what was the time period, any sort of special notes about it. So I think that's some of our most valuable content that we probably were able to share. And then I think also where the study was able to draw on an article from The Blade or an article from Tag Magazine or anything else, I would say that Rainbow History was safely probably part of the originator and of that material in the first place. So to put it, I think we were valuable for primary resources for Rebecca and the other people working on the study.
Yeah, did anybody else have any other comments for that at all? I'm just looking through the chat.
Well, Melyssa, there was a question about the NPS, what we were talking about with the comment about Annie's still being in use, and I can clarify that a little bit, which was that when Annie's moved to its current location in 1984, so the National Register, there's a 50-year rule. We don't have that here in DC. We're looking for sites that have had enough time that you can do evaluation of them, scholarly evaluation. For the National Register, they do have a 50-year rule, unless you are nominating it under criterion G for exceptional significance, and that's not what this was nominated for. And so they were looking for more information of the 1984 portion of the building that was the current location of Annie's. So because they had been at what is now JR's for quite a long time, that's where we run into this situation where it's a little bit more difficult. So they wanted more expression of its current day use as a place, a gathering place for the community.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting comment to get back. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Because somebody in the chat said Annie's at brunch on Sunday.
Yes.
So, yeah, and then Skip has a comment as well. So, per the religious element of the presentation, which St. Mark's, I guess these are sites that maybe they didn't notice in the context study, maybe could be included unless they are already. So Mark's Episcopal Church, Capitol Hill, and secondly, I was surprised that St. Thomas's DuPont was not mentioned. I don't know if those are in the context study, maybe just not mentioned during our presentation.
I was looking through, having co-authored this a little while ago. I was looking at, and at one point when we mentioned St. Mark's, we say St. Mark's Episcopal Churches, and then we say later we talk about the St. Mark's Episcopal Church, where GLF, GAA, and the Homophile Social League held events, and they note on 705. So they say 705 7th Street Southeast, I think that's Metropolitan Community Church, and then a 301 A Street Southeast, respectively. So the sites are, we have St. Mark's Episcopal Church, 301 A Street Southeast is the one that seems to be highlighted the most. And as far as, that's definitely the site that's highlighted in the context study. And as far as St. Thomas's DuPont, I didn't find reference to that. So we obviously may have missed that. And that's what's so important about gathering tonight, this evening, is to identify sites and themes we may have missed. So for example, in the question about the Washington Blade and the idea that it wasn't encompassed under media, maybe there's a larger media theme that needs to be included, and then other sites get subsumed under that if we miss those. So we're definitely, I'm sure obviously taking note here.
Yeah, we are. Let's see here. So Rob asks, what is the greatest barrier to preservation of LGBT history? And I think we kind of talked about this when it came to the comments that we received, but is there anything else? Comments we received specifically about like Slow Burl and Annie's, but is there like any other kind of barriers that maybe we can talk about too?
I think probably time and resources to continue the research is that I think one thing that we'd like to gather tonight too is also information on sites that may be already listed that can be amended, because when initial research has been done. For those of you who don't know, the DC Inventory of Historic Sites was established in 1964, and it was basically architects just saying, you get listed and you get listed and you get listed because you're pretty. And so it wasn't until 1978 when the Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act was enacted, but enacted in 1979, that buildings were then protected from demolition. So it's really kind of identifying locations that have this type of history. So maybe it may not be a site that is solely an LGBTQ site. So it may, but where can we add this history to it, like we've done with, say, St. Elizabeth's? We've talked about Lafayette Park being a cruising ground. That's not in the nomination. So it's those types of areas. Maybe Steve can talk a little bit more about where we could focus some of the efforts.
Yeah, I think that there's probably, it's probably a little bit of an easier lift to look at existing nominations that not just because they're protected, because a certain amount is already known about them, but there's certain stories and aspects of them that won't be known. So, for instance, many of the old theaters in downtown, the Warner, the Keith Albee, are written about a lot by gay men in the 1920s and 30s. That's where they went, every night to meet with friends and go to the theater. That's not their primary significance, but it's an interesting aspect that this was, close to, the YMCA, where a lot of single men lived, close to where they worked, and there was a relatively tight community that lived in downtown that went to Lafayette Square, and so but none of that history is captured in the individual nominations of those theaters and so that's potentially a way to broaden the story and broaden the awareness of marginalized communities that aren't necessarily captured in current day history. That's not to say that's the only venue, but again, for some of the reasons I already talked about of relatively recent significance or less than 50 years old, although we're getting to a point where the documentation of sites is capturing properties that are 50 or where their significance is 50 years old or older now. The challenge of the historical record, Rebecca Graham. I mean, that every now and then some amazing resource will come forth that we didn't know about before, and hopefully that will continue to happen. I mean, the St. Elizabeth's story, in which many of the medical records were being thrown away and were found, and I apologize because I don't remember the name of the gentleman who sort of captured this research and who's mostly responsible for it. But he has been instrumental in documenting through firsthand sources that were going to be thrown in the dumpster of much of the treatment of LGBTQ people at St. Elizabeth's Hospital. And so those sorts of records will hopefully continue to come to light and give us more insights into the history of either properties that are already protected or properties that we don't know that much about right now.
I think I would add one thing to that too, which is historically, LGBTQ people may have felt the need to pass or the need to fly under the radar screen. And I think it's not just people who will go under the radar. I think places go under the radar. And I could have walked by many things on 8th Street Southeast or maybe less DuPont Circle and not know the significance, even in the day, of what was going on there. So I think that that makes getting started a little bit harder. You're really relying on sometimes word of mouth stories passed down. So I think that's an interesting component to talking about space.
Yeah, and we have a question from Megan. and Katie kind of added on to it. So how does this context statement include or exclude the movement of the community between DC, Virginia, and Maryland? Megan also shared a link to Maryland's LGBTQ context study as well, if anybody wants to take a look at that. So I don't know if we have an answer for that, but I think it's definitely interesting to see where things kind of overlap or how people move throughout the DMV.
Yeah, I have a very brief answer to that, and I'm going to search through my memory catalog for a minute here and see if I can pull a good example of what I'm going to mention, which is that to my understanding, based off of when we wrote the context study, I think that organizations or events or people somehow needed to be like based in DC. But of course, there's a lot of swirl in the DMV, right? So for example, even though like you have folks working and doing organizing in DC or socializing in DC, they may have lived in the outskirts in Maryland and Virginia. So an example of that being like Lily Vincenne's Gay Women's Open House, which it was the Mattachine Society of Washington that she was a part of. And I was, organizing and doing activism within the district, but living in Arlington, then she carried the Gay Women's Open House, right, to her home, which was, again, in Arlington. And that part of what that did was she was like, if folks want to travel across the river and not be, as Jeff was kind of just talking about, as visible, feeling nervous perhaps to go to the bars or restaurants, like maybe bars and restaurants aren't their scene when they were coming out in that time, this is the decade of the 1970s. So that's, I think if that is, it could provide a good example of what I'm referencing here. Like the locus may have been originally in DC, but there may be, again, extensions outside of the district, but within the DMV where obviously the queer spaces started to like be a little more diffuse. Mm-hmm. So I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, and that's something we actually run into on a lot of these context studies that we're working on with our Asian American study with the Chinese and Korean communities. It's kind of confining our consultant because they want to do all of it, and especially in the borders and things like that. So it's kind of difficult when you're like, we're working within our 64 square miles. And so, but there always are references to the surrounding jurisdictions.
Okay, so we have a question from Craig. So are you coordinating with Charles Francis and other current leaders of the Born Again Mattachine Society of Washington, which specializes in archival activism?
Gosh, I don't know, Jeff, can you speak to that? We should. That's a clear we should in my mind.
Yeah, I guess I would have to say, Craig, thanks for the nudge.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't really have any real connection with them, but maybe that's a New Year's resolution.
Yep, good nudge.
Yeah, I think that's like something that's great about these kinds of projects is like there's so much either like collaboration currently happening or potential collaboration to kind of do this type of work, especially in the future. Let's see here, I'm looking through our stuff. I don't know if we have any questions from Facebook, but I'm gonna see if maybe Zach has anything. But thank you, everybody. We do have folks who are putting other sites into the chat, and we appreciate that. We're making a note of that. Especially Deacon, I see that you're adding quite a few in the Q&A, and this is great. So if anybody keep adding them, it is wonderful to see. Let me see here. And then Megan mentioned, I think that these context statements are just one way to document history. I think that we need a summary of regional scope. I think that's an important point. Let me see. Okay, no questions from Facebook. I mean, we're just kind of, I guess, throwing this out here as we wait for like other comments or questions. So, as we're having this, like, as we're seeing tonight, we're asking people for like their feedback, and maybe we can talk about, for this study specifically or others that are that we're working on, what is the role that the general community can play in contributing to studies like this, whether they'll be creating them or even afterwards? Like, what kind of role can people, I guess, play if they want to contribute? It's kind of a broad question, but
I think one thing that DCPL could add to this is what we've done for women's suffrage and the African American multiple property document, which was received today. So that one was our document that was, I guess, accepted in, what is it called, Steve, by the HPRB? It was something.
Accepted.
Accepted.
Yeah.
So we
Stamp
now
of
have
approval.
that document is having an online place where a forum where people can add sites and tell us about sites. So that way these could be added in the future. So that's definitely, I think, a step that DCPL could take in order to start gathering more information for when we do take the next step. Typically after a context study, a lot of times there will be a multiple property document where there is a larger list of buildings that are associated. And one thing that we learned with the African American MPD was a lot of the sites were no longer extant or surviving. And so we still had our consultant add those sites to the list. And so that way they are at least documented, even if they don't exist any longer. And so I think that that may be a logical next step for this project so that it can be expanded to include the sites that people can send to us.
And I don't know where this fits, but I was thinking about it as relating to getting feedback and input from the public. I think my sister decides to call me. I think the thing that we all need to be more conscious of is how we're representing the trans community, the T part of LGBTQ and gender non-conforming or non-binary. I think that's really an opportunity and a challenge for all of us who are working in any kind of preservation. And I think that's going to really take being out in the community and doing. I don't think we can expect the community to come to us. I think we have to figure out how can we get out in the community and listen and build trust and offer assurances. But I think if we're going to talk about an LGBTQ context study, and I'm not picking on this study at all, that we all had to be doing a better job with how are we thinking about the T part.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just to add what Jeff was saying too, that it's something I said briefly in my presentation, which is that context study itself focuses a lot through the mid to maybe late 1980s. My dissertation stops in the mid 80s. Which to some large degree informed the context study. So because of that, during the time period of that I looked at for my dissertation research, which was early 60s to mid 1980s, the city itself was primarily Black and white. So because of that, the context study does not capture other racial or ethnic groups, racial or ethnic LGBTQ groups that started in DC, which a lot of those groups came out of, I think, was it the 1987 March on Washington? So that's a big missing piece. And so the public comment piece, and I think is important there, but also we know a lot of those histories. So the work needs to, like Rebecca Miller was saying, the idea of needing time and resources, it just needs to be added upon and expanded upon beyond that time so that we can ensure that we're capturing more groups, including trans, gender, non-conforming or non-binary groups as well, which of course, as Jeff also said to earlier, actually highlighted earlier, a lot of these groups existed, but again, perhaps flew under the radar. So we need to be able to go dig and find, if we haven't already, more information about those groups and highlight them. So I just really want to put that out there in terms of what's missing and how the public can come in, but also just again, pinging the need for time and resources to expand the context scope.
Well, and I think you make a good point when you're talking about how your research goes into the mid 80s. And then you think about groups like Miss Adams Morgan Pageant, the DuPont Social Club, and Smile, and how they are, this new generation with their little smiles and advocacy for youth in the DMV area and things like that. which of course is a little plug because of course Miss Adams Morgan is this Saturday and Smile Brunch is the following Saturday. So happen to be very good friends with some of all the people. So those are great places to do. But one of them always says to me, well, is Miss Adams Morgan in here? And I'm like, well, I mean, your history is not that old in comparison to these other things that we typically talk about. So, and just looking at how those different communities have added to the context as it moves forward.
Steve, did you have any additional comments at all? Or?
No, although what Rebecca said sort of reminded me that when we pulled together the various advisors on this project, one of the challenges was to remind them that we were talking ultimately about a history project. And a lot of organizations wanted to talk about, what they're doing now. And that's of course very important, but it's not exactly what this project was about documenting. Although we did have conversations with people, with organizations, and encourage them, as Jeff was talking about, think about your archives, think about your the stuff that you're producing now is historical information or will be historical information that you think nothing of and you'll just throw away. Think about that. Don't do that. And the importance of saving things and documenting things that are currently happening so that there is an historical record to be drawn on in 5 or 10 or 50 years from now. And also to think about the importance of archiving and partnering with the Historical Society or MLK Library, something that's likely to be around for a long time, so that those resources can be retained.
And I guess kind of going off of these points that we've made, Katie asked, she'd like to hear more about the methodology used in undertaking this historic context study, and what other advice or recommendations you have for other localities in the development of creating similar studies or projects. If there's anything else you want to kind of put out there.
I mean, it's I guess in terms of the methodology, I remember initially that I believe folks were seeking somebody who had written, engaged really deeply with the city's, local organizing and socializing around LGBTQ groups. So, I know that's not much of a methodology. So you grab somebody to be sort of a co-chair who has is steeped in knowledge as much as possible and has some time for this, because I think other people were approached before me. And, even I was like, do I have the time for this kind of thing? But I really wanted to do it. So I just, made the time somehow at that point in my life. Methodology though was, and then we leaned on, other printed materials around LGBTQ organizing, socializing in the district. And then we had our advisory board, which of course included Mark Meinke, who we've mentioned, and who was a huge help. So, and then I worked in partnership with a woman who was at the architectural firm that we were connecting the context statement through, and the architectural firm itself had been the sort of winner of the award. And then I was brought in as somebody to help co-author it. So I know that's not really a tight methodology per se, but that was our method, if you will. And, other than that, I'm not sure the second half of the question, if anybody else wants to take that on.
Well, I think there was also an advisory group. So
yes,
when the advisory
absolutely.
group would, there was 2 phases of this project. Yep. So the first one being,
the first phase. That's right.
Mm-hmm,
Thank you for that reminder. Yep, that initial. Wow. Yeah, yes. That we had a large meeting actually with several people at that initial advisory group. Thank you. Keep going.
Yes. And so just to start off talking about themes and what the document was going to be. So, and then narrowing down those themes and if there's sub themes. So, and again, as we've explained, this is not an all-encompassing document. There's areas that can be improved. And this is one of the reasons that we wanted to have this program during LGBTQ History Month. And so to take your feedback, and you're welcome to send us feedback at DC Preservation. It's info@dcpreservation.org is our main email box, and we check that often, and we can save your comments and your suggestions for sites. And as we kind of move forward and figure out what the next steps are going to be.
Just so you all know, I put the email address in the chat, as well as the context study again, everybody's, the Office of Planning, Rainbow History Project, Capital Pride, websites, and DCPL in the chat as well. Also the recording I mentioned earlier about the Slow Burl program. But it is 7:13, so I want to give our panelists, I don't see any other, well, I did see one comment about we should be telling these younger groups to hang on to everything to share later. So that's very good, yeah. But I wanted to give them a chance if there's any other closing remarks or anything else you kind of wanted to let the public know before we end things.
Well, I want to thank Rebecca Graham and the Rainbow History Project for their. We were very lucky in DC to have such a body of knowledge that the Rainbow History Project had collected and was willing to share, and not just with us, but with the entire public. And then getting a subject expert to be our author for this. I felt like we were able to do this a lot faster than a lot of other communities. Maybe that sort of goes back to methodology and what lessons learned for how to advise other communities how to do this. A lot of communities have to spend a year or more doing the primary history research to just gather very, very basic information. And I felt like we had a jump start on that for all the research that had already been done, and then to get somebody who could pull that together and tell these really compelling stories through these chapters, of which it's not a book, it's not published, it's an ongoing living document. So we're very interested in how that's going to grow and evolve over time as we get more information.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And to the advisors that we had at that initial advisory meeting, they were lots of local art organizers and folks who came into with their expertise. So we were very lucky for a lot of eyes on the document. But we, just the last thing I would say is more eyes on the document is always welcome. So anybody who has continued feedback, please keep providing it, and we look forward to expanding on it. I guess whoever the we is in this case, DCPL and whoever else can support this, and of course HPO, Rainbow History Project. You all have been amazing partners in this. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess with that, we will end things here tonight. I just want to thank all of our panelists for taking the time to speak to our audience today, and everybody who attended today. Really appreciate you participating and putting in your own comments and your own questions.